What I would say is that what little I saw of this was absolutely educational. It's educational for not only Chinese Americans, but for all Americans, because through our schooling, our educational system, we really have little information coming out of our school system about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And even for me, as a third generation Chinese American, I've known very little except for the sacrifices the Chinese Americans have had to make as a result of the Exclusion Act. In my case, for example, my grandfather immigrated and came from China to the United States. He worked on the Southern Pacific Railroad and then was released and wound up in Ohio, where my father was born as the second generation. But I would say that in the case of my grandfather, because of the Exclusion Act, he really never became a U.S. citizen. He was prevented from having citizenship. In the case of my father, he was born in the United States, and he really loved not only the United States, but he understood the need and felt the importance of his Chinese heritage and Chinese customs. But in many respects, he was fortunate because he was born in the United States, whereas, and in fact, he served in World War II in the U.S. Army Air Corps, but the many Chinese American veterans who served in World War II, probably some 40% were not United States citizens, yet they fought for their country, the United States. And the basic reason that those, what I would call Americans of Chinese descent, but they were prevented from American citizenship because of the Exclusion Act, yet they fought for the United States. And it was the Exclusion Act that prevented them from becoming citizens, from being able to vote. And here it is today. We take too much for granted. We take our freedom, our liberty, our democratic principles for granted, and yet in our United States history, we have this Exclusion Act, and fortunately for all of us, that Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. What I would also say is the Chinese American veterans who fought in World War II helped to enable Chinese Americans of that generation to really become a part of the American mainstream. So they demonstrated their loyalty, their patriotism, and love of their country, the United States. And as a result, through other civic leaders, other Chinese American civic leaders, many of whom were members of the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, helped to make all Chinese Americans enjoy the civic freedom, the responsibilities of citizenship. So so that all Chinese Americans can now be in mainstream United States. And so, in summary, I would say it's important for Chinese Americans as well as all Americans, regardless of origin, to understand the Chinese Exclusion Act, the impact of the Chinese Exclusion Act upon the people of the United States. And so I highly recommend that there be wide distribution of this documentary on the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Bill Chen. I'm third generation Chinese American. In many respects, I'm a beneficiary of all that has been done by the Chinese American civic leadership that have supported civil rights actions. In my case, I had a career in the United States Army. I made the rank of Major General in the United States Army. I was the first Chinese American to wear the 2-star rank of Major General. And then after that, I was in the defense industry for 18 years, and now I'm retired.
Thank you.
Chen, and I enjoyed watching the documentary. I'm very impressed with the way the documentarian had researched this whole issue of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the incidents that led up to it, as well as what happened afterwards. One thing that I noticed was there was mention of women, and as a Chinese woman, I noticed that there was very little that they were able to lay their hands on in terms of what happened to the women that were trying to come or that were already in the United States. It seemed like they had a double whammy, meaning they were excluded, but they were even more, there was even more pressure on the women to prove. You have to prove themselves before being able to even enter the United States or be allowed to be a normal person living here. One of the things was the stereotypical notion of prostitution being associated with Chinese women that are coming here. I find that very, I don't know how they went through it, but it must be very tough. And I would like more on the women that were there in those days, how they survived, and what are some of the problems and challenges of being a woman in the U.S. Chinese woman trying to come here and be a wife or be a member of the society. It must be even more challenging than a lot of the men that were allowed to come. Okay, that's it. Thank you.